Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Sarah Fick, and I will be your program director tonight. I am the head of department of the Department of Public Law and Jurisprudence, and we are fortunate to have Professor van Marle as a member of our department. I'm delighted to see so many of you here to celebrate Professor van Marle and her scholarship. Just a few ground rules, so please keep your cell phone switched off. If you need to leave the venue, please do so at the back. On your seats, you should have found the program, so that is what we will be following today. Even if you didn't, don't worry about that. The first item is we will have the procession come in, the academic procession. I'm going to ask you to please stand for that. You can remain standing for the singing of the national anthem, but before we start singing, I will introduce the soloists to you. So please, or let me give them a moment to get ready. You can stand, please, for the procession. Thank you. The national anthem will be led by Ms. Karin Williams. She's a student at the Center of Performing Arts. Thank you. You may be seated. Thank you, Ms. Williams. I just want to extend a special greeting to Professor van Marle's family. Her husband, Donnie Brandt, and her daughter, Hannah, they are joining us online. Also joining us online is her mother, Sheila van Marle, as well as her sister, Estie van Marle-Kirster, and her family. I'm sure that they would have loved to be here in person, and I'm very glad that we can make you a part of this in this way. You must be very proud of Karin. Joining us in person is Professor van Marle's niece and nephew, Sheely Elof and Renee Elof, as well as Renee's father-in-law, Nicole Farsen. I'm very glad that you're able to join us today, and I know it means a lot to Professor van Marle. I would also like to extend a special greeting to Professor van Marle's colleagues from the University of the Free State, as well as the University of Pretoria. And I even see a lot of other universities people here too, and I'm sure you all played a big role in her journey to UWC. And with that, obviously, a hello to the UWC colleagues. I'd like to call upon Professor Tyrone Pretorius, the Rector and Vice Chancellor of the University, to welcome you all. Thank you.
Colleagues would know that I'm looking at I can tell you exactly, give me a moment. But I'm looking at my last days in office as Rector and Vice Chancellor. And I suddenly am paying more attention to my surroundings, to things that were in my face. Yes, Prof. Pierre, it is my last few months. 2 months, 6 days, 5 hours, 53 minutes, 25 seconds until I step down. And so now I'm suddenly starting to pay more and more attention to things that in the past I simply looked at without taking it in. And I noticed, Prof. de Vaux, your faculty banner, and I never saw that tagline at the bottom before, from bush to bench. How proud we are that this university has produced so many sitting High Court judges, Constitutional Court judges. Truly, you have a history and a legacy to be proud of. But good evening, colleagues, students, and guests. It is a privilege to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of Professor Karin van Marle. A warm welcome to our Acting Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Academic Professor Sean Pather, the Registrar, Dr. Nita Lawton-Misra, Deans, and in particular, the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Prof. Jacques de Ville. A special word of welcome to our inaugural lecturer, Professor van Marle, her family and friends, and everyone who has supported her on her journey to this moment. Thank you also to our colleagues from other faculties. I see Prof. Lalu and Prof. Grunebaum from the Center for Humanities Research, and also colleagues from other universities like Prof. Pierre de Vos, and all others that I might not acknowledge. The path to becoming a full professor is not an easy one. It requires years of perseverance and resilience, and perhaps most importantly, the support of a strong academic community. Academia, and research in particular, can be a very lonely exercise, especially in the humanities, in law, because unlike the scientists who works in laboratories and teams, ours is late night, poring over books, reading up in social isolation. Inaugural lectures, therefore, hold a special place in the life of a university, because it is then that we celebrate those moments and those moments of loneliness and those social isolation opportunities. Inaugural lectures mark the ascent to the rank of full professor, which is the highest academic rank within the university. It might be a bit of a misnomer to call it an inaugural lecture, as inaugural suggests the beginning of something, whereas inaugural lectures actually serves as a recognition of the work already done and the vision that the inaugural lecturer has for his or her future research endeavors. It also provides an opportunity for the professor to share their work with the broader university community, and that is why I'm so grateful that we have colleagues from other faculties. Because it's through these inaugural lectures that we can find out what's happening in other disciplines and where we can start laying fertile groundwork for interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and cross-disciplinary research. Professor van Marle's career has been shaped by a pioneering work in jurisprudence, legal theory, law and the humanities, and ethical feminism. I look forward to hearing about that. Feminism and law seems to be a strange mixture. So I look forward to hearing about that, Professor van Marle. Her extensive research has earned her international acclaim, along with several prestigious awards and fellowships. Tonight we have the privilege of hearing Professor van Marle's reflection on her academic journey and sharing the fundamental principles that define her work. I am confident that this lecture this evening will leave us all inspired, and it is my pleasure to invite the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Prof. Jacques de Ville, to formally introduce Professor van Marle to the audience. Prof. de Ville.
Thank you, Professor Pretorius, for those words of welcome, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just going to say a few things about Professor van Marle. Professor Pretorius has already said a few things about curriculum vitae, about her qualifications. In 1991, she received the Bachelor of Civil Laws at the University of Pretoria, and in 1993, the Bachelor of Laws degrees also at the University of Pretoria. In 1996, the Master of Laws at UNISA, and in 2000, her doctorate in laws also at the University of South Africa. She started her academic career while she was an undergraduate student as a research assistant in the Department of Public Law at the University of South Africa in 1993. And in 1997, she was appointed as a lecturer in the Department of Jurisprudence at UNISA. She then moved to the University of Pretoria, where she became a senior lecturer in 1999 and was promoted there to associate professor in 2002 and to professor in 2004. So this is not her first professorship that she holds. At the University of Pretoria, she was located in the Department of Jurisprudence, and she also served 2 terms as head of the department and several years as the faculty research director. She then moved to the University of the Free State in 2019 as a professor, and there she served also as the program director, research and postgraduate studies, and vice dean of the faculty. She became restless again and moved to UWC in 2022, just about 2 years ago. She joined us, and since then she has moved on significantly. She's also become the research chair in gender transformation and world making, That was from March 2023, and since the beginning of this year, she serves as the director of the re-established Research Unit for Legal and Constitutional Interpretation, or RULCI. A research field, Professor Pretorius already said something about that broadly within law and the humanities. It includes critical theory, legal philosophy, and jurisprudence. She's particularly worked in the field of post-1994 jurisprudence, where she engages with the crisis of modernity and rethinking law and legal theory along the lines of fragility, finitude, and giving up of certitudes. As Professor Pretorius also mentioned, Professor van Marle works within the field of ethical feminism, and her research and writing are embedded in feminist theory. Her research focus over the years has been on the question of transformation and living together, specifically the possibilities of transforming society towards the ideals of freedom, equality, dignity, social justice, and democracy for all, with an emphasis on gendered lives. To conclude, Professor van Marle has more than 132 publications on her CV. That includes 7 books as co-editor or co-author. And she has a significant number of having graduated 27 doctoral students so far. She has received various rewards, as mentioned, awards, as well as local and international fellowships over the years. She also holds a position of adjunct professor at the Southern Cross University in Australia. Professor van Marle, I hand over to you.
So I'm going to do my slides from here. We're going to move this. Okay. Oh, the clicker. Okay. Okay. Always check the technology first. All right, good evening. I would like to acknowledge and thank all members of the executive present tonight, also faculty management, specifically the Dean of Law, the Deputy Dean, both Deputy Deans being here, also the Acting Head of Department, Professor Ficken, Professor Leroux, who will act as respondent. But also good evening students, colleagues, friends, and family. The Vice-Chancellor and Rector, Professor Pretorius, kindly drew up a few guidelines on what to include in an address such as this one. So the guidelines are that the person giving the address, firstly, should say something briefly about their bio, their positionality, and then expand on the academic focus of the lecture. I, in particular, appreciated the guidelines stating that the underlying objective is to present a lecture that captures the essence of what you profess. I've often asked colleagues, particularly those at professorial level who are less enthusiastic about teaching, the question, who do you profess to, if not to students, if not by teaching? Not to say, of course, that we don't also profess when we write or present lectures to scholars or fellow academics, but I believe that students, in the first place, should benefit from such a professing. But then the question on what do we profess? I sometimes, when listening to other academics and when I listen to what students report on their lectures and lecturers, I wonder if there's always sufficiently professing going on. Lots of stating, describing, summarizing, sometimes pontificating, but maybe not always professing. So having said that, to profess is no easy task, but nevertheless one that I will attempt to take up tonight. The guidelines also said that one should hone in on salient elements of one's scholarly contributions over the period of one's career, knowledge, outputs, and contributions, add impacts on the body of knowledge, practice, policy, and to conclude by looking to the future. I will make only 2 comments about my positionality. As you've heard, I was promoted to full professor at UP in 2003, and I took up the position on the 1st of January. So I've been serving as a full professor for more than 20 years. And I really want to thank everyone above that I've mentioned for this opportunity to reflect on what I've been doing or professing or attempting to profess over the past 20 years. I did give an inaugural at UP, but at the time, that was also linked to my inauguration as head of department, so I will make a few references to that lecture, but I see my task in this lecture tonight also as doing something different, not only because of the passing of time. But maybe for the other comment on my positionality, I want to draw on the late Drusilla Cornell's distinction between identity, identification, and positionality. Cornell's work was instructive in both my master's and doctoral work, and who became a mentor, a colleague, a comrade, and a dear friend, was much more of an activist than I ever was. She was intimately involved in unions, labor strikes, activist organizations throughout her life. And as you've heard, one of her contributions to scholarship was her notion of ethical feminism that permeated everything she wrote, and I believe that she did. It was thus important for her to respond to the world and all worldly matters in an ethical manner. In this vein, Cornell distinguished between identity, identification, and positionality. And she was firm about the fact that even though she identified with struggles against racism, sexism, and classism, and all other forms of oppression, she was very well aware of her positionality, her privilege as a white female academic. So the reason why I'm recording Cornell's distinction here is to state my own positionality as a white, middle-class, middle-aged, privileged, Afrikaans-speaking female academic. Since growing up under apartheid, in particular being a teenager under states of emergency in the 80s, I've identified with the struggle against apartheid. As a student, albeit at the former traditional white university, I was involved in left student politics. My academic work as a researcher and a teacher, I believe, has been informed by this identification, but keeping in mind my positionality. I've worked at UNISA, at UP, at the UFS, taking up office, and I elaborate on this in a moment, at the University of the Western Cape has a very specific meaning for me. Working at other universities, I was often asked if I would prefer working elsewhere, at Wits, or Stellenbosch, or UCT, and my response throughout the years consistently has been that the only other university in South Africa where I would like to work is UWC. So it is an immense privilege to give this lecture that is at UWC, that historically has been the university for the left, and I believe still is and should be. Since I started here, I haven't always heard many people invoking this notion. I've heard people talking about the shifting meanings of left, that it may be time to reflect on such meaning. And I sense sometimes that some people would like to disavow this experience or description as something that is not relevant anymore. Others might feel that it has become an empty signifier. I do want to work on this notion and intend to do it in the near future. Tonight's lecture is not about this meaning in the first place, although it is definitely informative to that title of my address, namely, taking up office, jurisprudence, space, place, interpretation, and cohabitance. So what do I profess? I take this question to ask both what I profess, but also how do I profess? In order to respond, it may be important to unpack a few terms. Firstly, jurisprudence. And here I will refer to my UP Inaugural, which I based on the artwork of Gustav Klimt, titled Jurisprudence. and the first part of the top part of the painting has been cut off, unfortunately. But Klimt portrays jurisprudence not as an institution that could benefit society, but rather as harmful, a punitive and ambitious vengeful power. In the center of the painting, we see a naked man who is held tightly in the grip of an octopus-like creature that devours him. The man is surrounded by three furies who administrate justice instead of truth, justice, and the law, who occupy a marginal position in the painting. Even though in terms of hierarchy, truth, justice, and the law are at the top of the painting, the naked man and the furies are centered. This has the effect that the three furies here, the administrators of justice, but traditionally mythical instruments of revenge, and the naked man are seen as more important than truth, justice, and the law. Panu Minkinen observes that the majority of the legal community accused Klimt of reducing the function of the law in society to the execution of punishment and of not paying sufficient attention to the constructive possibilities of law. But many of his defenders argued that the portrayal was an accurate depiction of the fundamental violent essence of the law. For Minkinen, both these evaluations come down to one single interpretation, and he asks whether there might be other dimensions involved in the painting that escape our enlightened eyes. He notes Klimt's choice to call the painting jurisprudence and not law, and continues that the painting is accordingly not about law, but about a juridical mode of prudence, of a foresight that is related to law. In the previous lecture, I also relied on some works by William Kentridge, and I argued that the artistic portrayals of Klimt and Kentridge disclose some of the tensions and struggles of and for the becoming of a post-apartheid or maybe post-1994 jurisprudence. I concluded that this kind of jurisprudence is a project that entails thought and thinking. It is a notion that involves reimaginings, refigurings, and reorientations. It is a notion that must be imbued with a strong sense of political friendship and democracy. I situated and related the teaching of and research on jurisprudence within and also to the notion of the university as a heterogeneous public space that urges an engagement with complex thinking. But back to tonight's lecture and the definition of jurisprudence. I subscribe, and I have been, people will know, to the view of jurisprudence as the consciousness and conscience of law. Law's knowledge and law's conscience, law's ethics. Related to this view, I also approach jurisprudence as a following Genevieve, so this is a quote, as a public art obliged to care for law's forms and methods. In this vein, I want to reflect on this question: what does it mean to take up the office of the jurisprudent? But this taking up of office does not happen in a neutral space, in a kind of nowhere, but in a specific place at a specific time. I'm reminded here of the words of Lucy, one of the main characters in James Coetzee's Disgrace. At this time, in this place. If place invokes the notion of relation, of human interaction, of community, even if inoperative or fragmented, continuously becoming, what about space? So space could be read as more institutional, but also more theoretical, philosophical, sociological. Some will say more abstract. But I subscribe to the idea that space is political and also relational. If I invoke a certain place, space, and time as informative for my work or for what I profess, firstly, of course, the space and time is South Africa, which after the ending of institutional legitimized exclusion and oppression is sadly also a time and place of its endurance. And I have some visuals here by photographer Herman Verwey portraying Schubert Park, and I don't have time to expand on the Schubert Park story, specific story of a building in Tshwane, Pretoria, but for me, some of these photos reflect something about the place and space that we're working from, and that, for me, at least symbolizes something about jurisprudence. You can see here the memory of a nursery school, but now in rubble. Some of the photos of Pretoria and the 3 buildings. And maybe then this is Kentridge, to say something about place. So maybe a few other terms. Jurisprudent, taking up office, jurisography. And here I draw on and I learn from scholars who, in the Australian context, of course Australia as another settler colony, developed the notion of jurisography, with which they mean the demonstration of the practice of jurisprudence, a way to give shape to the conduct of life, traditions, and ethos of engagement with that which we inherit, write about, a different set of duties of disciplinary life. And I rely on a book, Feminist Jurisography, in which Genovese, following Simone de Beauvoir, asks what it means to become the author of your own knowledge and experience. Jurisography for her means to make visible the practices of law, the conditions of living with law. She underscores the need to give technical or aesthetic or performative attention to or acknowledgement of one's own situation and obligations, and I think this relates to Cornell's positionality. A jurisographer's key public duty is to take care of the many forms and sources of writing. She writes her introductory chapter as a series of notes, firstly to acknowledge the extent to which women often do academic work in conjunction with many other things, amongst others caring for others, feeding children, and at that time, and that time often allows nothing more than jotting a note at the kitchen table. But secondly, notes also because she wants to refuse the assumed completeness of standard academic writing. Jurisography is about jurisprudential writing concerned with the tradition of conduct, and very importantly, is about the relationality of writing. Referring to the office then of the jurisprudent, she distinguishes between expressing oneself through art and the art of fashioning a self through activity. And the latter is the one that speaks to the work of the jurisprudent, the art of fashioning a self through activity. Genovese reads de Beauvoir's The Second Sex as a jurisprudential text, as well as a training manual, providing a set of technical exercises on how to write in conversation with others, on the art of living. De Beauvoir gave an exposition of how knowledge and its material forms and customs are organized relationally between men and women for the benefit of men in a way that oppresses women. Genovese comments on the genre of the essay then as something immediate and intimate that de Beauvoir relied on, and that opens something that could have remained a philosophical problem, namely the suppression of women, to a broader public readership. The Second Sex then as jurisprudential text reveals the relation between the writer's experience and her writing, relationality, the inheritance of knowledge, and how it is connected to practical formalism, but still accepted the centrality or dominance of law. Postmodern jurisprudence challenged the idea of totalizing experience of human life and knowledge, and disclosed what today we know as law and the humanities. To write jurisprudence, then, is to start from oneself, one's place and placement. Writing jurisprudence within the context of places like Australia and South Africa urges also an acknowledgement of how institutional knowledge has shaped race relations as well as gendered relations. Jurisprudence is not a discourse to be mastered. It's rather a type of know-how. It is a continuous, practical activity of living in and seeing the world, inhabiting the persona of the jurisprudent, is a political and an intellectual act. So what does jurisography as a practice that is concerned about jurisprudence writing, belonging to a tradition of conduct mean and entail in such a place and time? And here I need to recall Robert Cover, who famously asserted the extent to which we create law and live a law through our narratives. He insisted that what law teachers mostly tell students about law, rules and principles of justice, the formal institutions of the law, and the conventions of a social order, provides only a partial account of the normative universe that claims our attention. He underscored that no law or legal institution exists in isolation from the narratives within which it is situated and its meaning created. And he famously declared, for every constitution, there is an epic. For each decalogue, a scripture. Law is thus not simply a system of rules that should be followed, but a world in which we live. Cover noted the extent to which legal interpretation, legal hermeneutics, the question of meaning in law is often associated with a specific problem on which an official must decide. However, he urges us to see this also differently and acknowledge that the normative universe is held together by the force of interpretive commitments, and that these commitments ultimately decide the meaning and existence of law. Legal orders and principles are for him signs by which each of us communicate with others. Cover worked with a number of important and related distinctions in his engagement with law. Two versions of nomos, the insular and the redemptive, and two ways of interpreting law, one being jurisgenerative, the other jurispathic. Two patterns or communities, the one being pedaic, the other imperial. But maybe just first his insistence on jurisgenesis, the creation of legal meaning, which he describes as being collective or social. He distinguishes then between a social basis for jurisgenesis and then one that is jurispathic, one that destroys legal meaning. The corresponding patterns then are pedaic and imperial. Pedaic is a world-creating pattern, which corresponds with redemptive interpretation and requires three things: common narratives, a common personal education, and the possibility for transformation. The imperial pattern, corresponding with insular interpretation, is world-maintaining and insists that norms are universal and enforced by institutions. But of course, Cover explains that one will never find a model that is totally pedaic or totally imperial. All versions of law, nomos, need to carry predictable and non-predictable behavior. The very notion, of course, of jurispotence, the ideal of a pedaic order, is threatening to those who only want to maintain. Multiplicity of meaning that is created by jurisgenesis often leads to the assertion of imperial virtues and world maintenance. But Cover, importantly, also reminds us that legal interpretation takes place in a field of pain and death. Because of violence, courts are often jurispathic rather than jurisgenerative. Jurispathic courts then often define the problem not as having too much law, but rather as unclear law. So by asserting the problem as unclear, courts work on the assumption that there's only one correct or superior interpretation or form of law. On the other hand, to understand the problem as too much law is to acknowledge multiple and plural versions of law emanating from different communities and experiences. But I'm concerned with the question, taking responsibility for the conduct of a lawful life. What does it mean to take responsibility for a lawful life? McVie takes up this notion in a piece where he focuses on how someone acting in the office of the jurisprudent in London can take responsibility for the conduct of a lawful life. He situates this question within a framework of minor jurisprudence. Taking up office for a jurisprudent accepting minor jurisprudence then means the assumptions of duties, rights, and the privileges of public life. And McVie rightfully notes that there are different views on both the responsibilities and training of the jurist and jurisprudent. And we just had a LLB review workshop on Tuesday, and we know there are different views. With reference to the minor jurisprudence of Minkinen, McVie notes the importance of the desire for justice, as well as holding justice and truth in relation to one another, which is, of course, a paradoxical activity. Although justice is strived for, human desire can't achieve it. The jurisprudent, in Minkinen's view, plays the role of the philosopher-jurist. The jurisprudent should find a way of living with the tragic limits of office. For Goodrich, the training offered by minor jurisprudence includes the arts of association and amity and enmity, and those of interpretation and transmission. Also, we can refer to the minor jurisprudence as practiced by Andreas Philippopoulos Michalopoulos, which involves an engagement with spatial justice, as well as the material and spatial ordering of a lawscape. An interesting aspect of spatial justice, as supported by Philippopoulos Michalopoulos, is his notion of withdrawal, which McVie describes as embodied, spatio-temporal, and strategic. The suggestion is withdrawal from human judgment and to keep up clarity of judgment. They support the minor jurisprudence, also a public teaching of law, either through philosophy, philology and allegory, or mindfulness or affect. They all share the idea that training in personality involves a cultivated withdrawal from the everyday forms of technical and material life in order to effect transformation in relation to the self and to conduct of office. What is taught are exercises for the cultivation of the experience of new thresholds of law and life. Theorists of a minor jurisprudence incorporate persona and place in the training of the jurisprudent. They attend to either the connection between university and community, allegiance and friendship of the city, or a cosmopolitan ethos. I do not want to, nor can I present the thrust of my position, discipline, what and how I profess in a single sentence or list of bullets. And luckily, I do not tonight have to complete a jot form or do a mapping exercise on an Excel sheet. I do jurisprudence. I read and research and write and teach and to a great extent live it. Jurisprudence as law's consciousness and law's conscience. Jurisprudence as constantly seeking lawful relations, ways to respond to, repair, give redress to enduring violence, albeit limited, limiting, and often failing. I subscribe to a minor jurisprudence. A minor jurisprudence offers a different way to take up office by addressing aspects of conduct that mark thresholds and transformations of various kinds. Relying on cultural theory, minor jurisprudence relates taking up office to humanist training and asserts that public institutions are sources of relations. But let me briefly turn to my work in and on jurisprudence over the past 20, maybe 30 years. I have been and still am conscious of the role of space and place in giving meaning to in interpreting law. Drawing on insights in spatial theory about the production of space and theorists on temporality, I argue for a spatial and temporal reading of jurisprudence and constitutionalism. The historical self-consciousness of the Constitution, underscoring the importance of time, space, and place, should not only be heeded, but should guide every act of interpretation. I understand interpretation as an act of augmentation and translation, but also as recollective imagination. Ethical feminism and the emphasis it places on difference has been central to my work over many years. The right to difference is also at the heart of the spatial theorist André Lefebvre's notion of the right to the city. I place difference, interpretation, and cohabitance next to each other in my reflection on the office of the jurisprudent, of someone teaching and doing research in the field of jurisprudence at UWC as the University for the Left. I've been in the Office of Jurisprudence, or as jurisprudent for many years, engaging with the question of how jurisprudence can respond to the past and present, the violence, patriarchy, apartheid, colonialism, denial of values and rights, and limits on political action. A central theme to all of my writing from completing my master's degree is the possibility or the impossibility of transformation. Transformation is radical change, not mere evolution or reform. I have always been cautious and critical about the role that law or the Constitution can play. The limits of the law is a phrase that I've used, maybe overused in my writings. An early disappointment with equality, and in particular the Constitutional Court's embrace of substantive equality, prompted me to argue for an ethical approach of equality as an attempt to highlight the failure of the law, but also for the court to respect radical difference. At the heart of an ethical approach to equality, as I suggested, was for law, constitutional law, to be self-aware of its limits. I followed Cornell's understanding of ethical feminism as the insistence on sexual difference, but not in any essentialist manner, an insistence on sexual difference whilst denying the possibility to describe women in any one way. And I've recently returned to ethical equality and related it to Simone de Beauvoir's work on ambiguity. My approach to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was very much influenced by Antjie Krog's Country of My Skull, which in following Louise Viljoen, I read as a specific engagement with movement from and between ordinary places and spaces. I've evaluated the TRC as the creation of, or making space and time for a moment for the country to reflect, and a place from where the enduring struggle of reconciliation, memory work, reparation, redress could continue. If the TRC failed to reconcile, remember, repair, and redress, and it did, it is this very failure that discloses and insists and prompts the work to continue. Inspired by the writing of Milan Kundera, but also the art, in particular the drawing of technique of Willem Kentridge, I configured an approach to law and interpretation that takes its cue from slowness and repetition, erasure and redrawing, establishing a rhythm, but also a sense of place. This approach draws on memory, history, and the historical self-consciousness and the Constitution to create a palimpsest. And as I'm writing this, or now reading this, I also see how this rhythmic repetition and activity of layering engage with the middle space. And I return to this below. So the historical self-consciousness of the Constitution also prompted me to think about the Constitution as archive and related to the work of the late Laurens du Plessis on Monument and Memorial, but also the work of André van der Walt and other colleagues present here tonight. I worked on refusal not as a nihilist rejection of law or politics, but refusal of a certain kind. Adriana Cavarero's Penelope, weaving her wedding dress by day and unraveling it at night, creating not only a specific feminine sense of time, but also a specific sense of place and space. I've referred to my inaugural at UP that focused on jurisprudence and friendship and the university as holding on to plurality. I have taken up the office of jurisprudence over many years, in particular critical jurisprudence, relying on critical theory, ethical feminism, literature, spatial theory, the city as guiding metaphor. And in this vein, I understand and research and teach law as a humanities discipline. If scholars are concerned about the crisis in the humanities, or as a global seminar in which I participated 2 weeks ago was framed, the war in the humanities, I fear also for law or jurisprudence, or at least the kind of law or jurisprudence that I think is worth exploring and protecting. So I'm not going to speak to what my contribution has been. I believe it's not for me to say. In that way, I may be an old school academic, and the insistence on the use of templates and Google Forms and e-portfolios to market ourselves is a world that I, like Bartleby, will prefer not to engage with. What made all of this worthwhile, and still does, is my engagement with students, undergrad and postgrad, over many years. Seeing students completing a module with success, graduating, building a life has been one of the most fulfilling things. Many of my students, many present here, are now excellent scholars, building their own legacies, and I value them and admire them. But another most gratifying moment is to ever so often bump into someone saying to me, "You taught me jurisprudence." And at the time, I hated it. But now, I understand why it is important. Thank you. And I get that from former students who are now in practice, sometimes doctoral candidates, or even those who are living a life outside of law. So my future work will, to a great extent, continue with the work that I've been doing over the past 30 years. I ended the inaugural address at UP quoting Derrida, saying, "These things are difficult, I admit. Their formulation can be disconcerting. But would there be so many problems and misunderstandings without this complexity and without these paradoxes? One shouldn't complicate things for the pleasure of complicating, but one should also never simplify or pretend to be sure of such simplicity where there is none. If things were simple, word would have gotten round." So things are still not easy. Nothing has been resolved. Word has not gotten round. So the struggle, the writing, the reading, the thinking continues. Maybe more than you, my future work will revisit, expand, deepen some of the notions that have been a concern. Inspired by thinkers that I've been engaging with over many years, Hannah Arendt, Jacques Derrida, Drusilla Cornell, to name a few, but also new ones, Stephen Klingman, Italian author Elena Ferrante. I'm interested to focus more on borders, boundaries, and limits, and the idea of the middle as a critical space. So on boundaries. As legal scholars, we often encounter dichotomies that manifest in the drawing of borders, boundaries, and limits. For example, property law and the concept of ownership, to a great extent, relies on the demarcation of a certain geographical area, demarcated by the drawing of borders and boundaries. Time limits, cut-off dates are often central in legal regulation. The very way in which we distinguish fields of law from each other, public, private, commercial, constitutional, relies on distinctions and borders. Jurisdiction, to decide where a case can be heard, geographically, but also in which order of court, lower, higher, supreme, district, constitutional, all depends on how borders or boundaries are drawn, limited or determined. Locus standi, who has standing, is determined by reliance on borders and boundaries. Rights are often approached as separate entities to be applied in a way that amounts to stronger rights trumping weaker rights. Legal argument, to a great extent, distinguishes between what information, facts, can be regarded as relevant to the case, but also what law or doctrine or legislation or precedent apply or not. We could take a step back here and concede that not only law, but in a way, Western thinking is centered around dichotomies or distinctions between mind and body, rational and emotional, public, private. But I'm interested to think how we can think differently about these distinctions and borders, boundaries, and limits. Can we make sense of borders, boundaries, and limits by thinking in terms of relations, entanglements, and complicities? Scholars who focus on relationality within the context of rights, for example, argue that instead of viewing rights as separated, as done by traditional rights discourse, we should focus on how they are in fact intertwined and not separate. Jennifer Nadowski famously supports a relational approach to rights and argues against boundaries. Her understanding of autonomy is very much embedded in her support of relations as a way to structure and interpret rights. We can also think of Hannah Arendt as a thinker of boundary spaces. For her, politics, action, and speech take place exactly in the in-between that makes human interaction possible. She's interested in that which lies in between the categories and concepts. What she calls the right to have rights is an example of such an in-between, a right that is neither inside nor outside the law. In the South African context, scholars have shown how even the starkest attempt to separate people by the former National Party's policy of apartheid failed to completely separate people. Sarah Nuttall discusses a number of scholars who invoke metaphors of relation rather than separation by drawing on the seam, the kok, or complicity Sanders over and above her own work on entanglement. These invocations are suggestive for critical engagements with the way traditional approaches to law rely on stark divisions and boundaries. Of course, Cornell's work on the limit is instructive. She famously renamed Derrida's notion of deconstruction to the philosophy of the limit. The limit for her, instead of indicating an end, designates an opening, a range of possibilities, relying on the twofold meaning of difference. Firstly, as difference in meaning, but secondly, as postponement. Deconstruction as the philosophy of the limit is a way to think about interpreting law that discloses multiple possibilities for meaning, but more importantly, for the possibility of justice. So I'm busy with a special edition for a journal of law and critique, and it engages with the themes of legal culture, transformation, and hospitality. And my own contribution is a response to Stephen Klingman on models of hospitality. Klingman's question on what happens when the world becomes inhospitable is pertinent and relates to work that I've been busy with for a while on the possibility of cohabitation, living together in this country, in this world. And I draw on the work of Arendt and her approach to writing that instead of presenting us with a final theory or argument, rather tries to understand adequately the phenomenon of politics, or rather to think what we are doing. An interesting distinction is drawn between thinking and contemplation. She says, thought conceived of as a mere means to lead up to the end of contemplation is not an activity, but a passivity. It is the point where mental activity comes to rest. So the implication is that thinking or thought as activity has been forgotten to be replaced by thought as making. If in the human condition, Arendt prompts us to think what we are doing, she asks much later in the life of the mind, what are we doing when we do nothing but think? Her aim is to help us to make sense of thought without relating it to contemplation, which for her is nothing but a process strictly obeying the rules of logic. Arendt thus distinguishes between thought and knowledge. The end of thought is not truth, but meaning. Knowledge or cognition aims to find out what something is and if it exists. If action and speech have been taken over by fabrication, thinking has been instrumentalized and replaced by contemplation. And of course, this is all bad for Arendt, something that we should resist. The question that arises then is, what kind of thinking can escape being instrumentalized, being overtaken by making? And this question relates to a question Arendt asks in her Denktagebuch, her thinking diary, namely, is there a thinking that is not tyrannical? Thomas Wilde notes that the question of non-tyrannical thinking preoccupied Arendt for several years and guided her thinking on the political, her reading of philosophy, and her modes of writing. He reads this question together with her statement that the challenge of the post-war era was to face and to come to terms with what really happened, and regards this as a challenge of understanding, judgment, and writing regarding the process of coming to terms with. The context in which she raises these is where she reflects in her thinking diary on the close relation between philosophy and the tyrant since Plato. She writes that the laws of logic are much more related to tyranny than freedom. Interestingly, she asserts here that humans are not political, but rather that politics and freedom originate in what lies between people. Arendt questions the principle that underlies philosophy, namely adequatio rei et intellectus, which connects the adequacy of knowledge and subject. She invokes Hegel, who notes that the movements of the mind and the movements of events match insofar as the intellectual swimming of man, and I think one can add a sick here, continues to match the tide. Marx apparently argued that the swimmer is stronger than the tide and can arrange world events according to his stride. Arendt responds to this by saying that the question is how to avoid swimming in the tide at all. Weld notes that Arendt's main concern is with the and, or the et, that binds knowledge and subject. In the Denktagenbuch, the entry that follows these passages is a poem by Emily Dickinson, ending with a line, "Homelessness for home." Weld asks, what is the connection, if there is one, between her thinking about the unsettled relationship between reality and the thinking about reality and a poem? So what we find in Arendt's thinking diary is a way of writing that describes a process, a mode by which reality can be confronted, words sought and found and brought into writing. The word "and" does important work here. It simultaneously brings together and breaks apart. And of course, one is reminded here also of Derrida's comments on the conjunction "and." Another way in which Arendt's view on thinking that is not tyrannical comes to the fore is in her writing on judging. Judging for her had nothing to do with the logic of either deduction or induction. She believed that the question on the relationship between judgment and history was important to ask. Wilde explains that Arendt engaged with the question of tradition or development by focusing on a specific word and on the moment when it became a concept, thereby retrieving a moment of undecidedness which makes deciding possible. Reflecting on the word Geschichte or history, Arendt turns to the Greek word historiein, which had several meanings. If willing is directed to the future, judgment for Arendt is par excellence a way of reflecting on the past, but importantly, by relating events. The double meaning in English of relating is also of interest here, referring to both telling and connecting what happened. Arendt is relating here also two ways of writing and telling, story and history. Judgment is also about relating the particular with the universal. She makes distinctions that do not close possibilities of entanglement. By distinguishing, she also relates and creates opportunities for new meaning. It is this way of relating that guides her understanding of history. History not as development along a linear or chronological line, but rather as related moments. Is there a way of thinking that does not turn tyrannical? For Arendt, there is, by relating, by holding on to plurality, by thinking poetically. For Arendt, Walter Benjamin's gift of thinking poetically involved quotation and thought fragment, the capacity to interrupt and to assemble. I turn to David Scott, within a Caribbean theorist who, within the context of his tribute to Stuart Hall, unpacks the notion of an ethics of receptive generosity drawing on Roman Coles. Scott focuses on the ethical implications of Hall's dialogical style, which encompassed a specific mode of speaking and listening. He underscores the extent to which this was also an ethics of responsiveness to difference. Scott phrases this dialogical ethics as an ethics committed to the virtue of an ongoing, agonistic negotiation of belonging, in identity, and difference among plural voices. He also invokes the term historically constituted pluralizations. The ethics concerned here is specifically one that amounts to reciprocal responsiveness to varieties of otherness and marginalization. Scott describes what he calls an attitude of vulnerable openness to learning from others, not merely masterfully teaching them. Related to Derrida's critique on cosmopolitanism, he describes cosmopolitan hospitality as an ethics of tolerance amounting to nothing more than a passive making room for needy others. Scott relates an ethics of receptive generosity to a tragic sensibility, which he defines as an orientation towards moral political reflection that honors the role of chance and paradox and contingency and conflict and resentments and ambiguity and finitude. Such a tragic ethics is open to frailty and plurality and vulnerability. Scott relies on Cole's notion of working from a border position as a tension-laden dwelling, of which the aim is to think and act from the concrete present toward a left project as the horizon of possibility. Scott relies also on Cole's to ask, how can we think anew, think differently by learning from others? For Cole's, we can only do that if we read sympathetically by reading what is most generative in a thinker's thinking and not what is least. Cole's believe that we should read less to find fault and rather read to expand, deepen, thereby pressing texts, nudging them, stretching. And he invokes this idea of tension dwelling also to describe the dialectic or the tension between closure and disclosure. He refers to the claim of community of history that takes place in that moment of tension dwelling, where closure or reification is disturbed or disrupted, and exactly not the moment when difference or displacement solidifies, seeking to name and sustain itself. Briefly, Adriano Cavarero, who starts her work on inclination by invoking a remark made by Walter Benjamin in relation to Kant, namely, that if we could think differently about inclination, it could turn out to have profound meaning for morality. Cavarero notes that it is not clear exactly what Benjamin meant, but assumes that he was referring to the negative stance in which the ethical tradition conceives of human inclinations. Kant provides a good example of a general philosophical attitude on inclination, which does not appreciate inclination, but rather combats it. Cavarero remarks that there are numerous methods relied on by philosophy to reject inclination and to underscore verticalization, the upright man, as alternative. Not only Benjamin, but also Arendt commented on this treatment of inclination in Kant, noting that every inclination turns outward. It leans out of the self in the direction of whatever may affect me from the outside world. So Cavarero argues that this remark reminds us that the meaning of the word inclination points to a geometrical imaginary, clarifying the extent to which the center stage is taken when an eye, by an eye's position, is straight and vertical. She notes that words like righteousness and rectitude are often found in dictionaries of morals and were used in the Middle Ages for the rectification of bad inclinations. This view provides the reason for philosophers seeing inclination as a perpetual source of apprehension, a view that, even though present in each epoch, gains strength during modernity, Western modernity, when Kant's free and autonomous individual comes to the fore. As per Arendt, inclination disturbs the eye by pushing it away from its internal center of gravity, making it lean to the outside. This outside, being objects or people, undermines the eye's stability. Her response, drawing on Arendt, is that we should not break this all and ever-present subject, but rather incline it. She explains, instead of breaking its vertical axis into multiple pieces, one could try bending it, giving it a different posture. This bending could involve inclining the subject toward the other, which fits well into what has been described as the relational model. So I see this bending, this inclining, also as a reaching towards a middle space, a space of negotiation maybe compromise, a political, messy, difficult space, but nevertheless one of inclination, and this for me is the space of jurisprudence. So finally, Klingman, who approaches the notion of boundary as a space of negotiation and encounter, rather than a fixed structure like a wall. He draws on work by scholars previously mentioned, also de Kock and Nuttall, who developed the notions of seam and entanglement as crucial spaces in post-colonial, post-apartheid contexts. A boundary invokes also transition, and although it is no doubt not an easy space to live in, it has possibilities for liberation. In a work titled The Grammar of Identity, he describes the nature of boundary as a notion of movement that perpetually dissolves as it shifts. The grammar of identity is for him the grammar of the transitive, helping us to redefine our sense of location and to rethink the nature of boundaries. Relying on linguistics, he notes the distinction between expressions that allow selection or substitution and those that allow combination. In terms of semantics, distinction is made between similarity and contiguity, and he supports a notion of transition, navigation, mutation, and alteration. So maybe a final but crucial voice to include, Gillian Rose's beautiful reflection on the broken middle. I can in no way do justice to her complex and rich thoughts here. Rose writes the middle with reference to philosophy's grey in grey as a motile configuration. The middle is not a space of prescription or prescription, not even a space where one imposes ideals or imagines communities or narrative progressively. It's rather one of changed relation, reconfiguration. Rose's concern is the crisis of ethics in modern political life, how Western democracy foreclosed the middle as possible space of encounter. Diremption between ethics and metaphysics lies at the core of this crisis. Her suggestion is not to mend, but rather to highlight how attempts to mend thought or possibility of co-belonging and co-becoming. The broken middle holds no absolute truth, but also no absolute contingency. In place of the opposition of Athens and Jerusalem, Rose's example, the broken middle for her offers activity beyond activity, the risks of critical rationality and of political action. Before I wrap up, I just also would like to do a short word of thanks. I know Professor Mbembe will also thank the executive and university executive and faculty executive on my behalf, but maybe from me also a big thank you to everyone involved in the arrangements. I don't know everyone and I don't have all the names, but maybe Ms. Hazel Jefta and her team, thank you very much, Ms. Cheryl Davids, Mr. Chancellor, Ms. Adelaide Simons, but also so many colleagues to thank. And maybe just want to mention and acknowledge a few people who have moved onto another world. Rika Pretorius, who at UNISA was one of the first people who took me under her wing. The late Laurens du Plessis, André van der Walt, Duart Klein, Christoph Heinz, Philippe van Houten, Drusilla Cornell, but also colleagues at UP and UFS and UWC here tonight. Basil, colleague, comrade, friend who will do the response, thank you very much. Again, and I've mentioned the students, but again, I want to say we find ourselves in a moment where we are constantly asked to provide evidence for everything we do. Sometimes, even when we provide evidence, it's not enough, or it's not the right type. But for me, the many and numerous students throughout the years are the only concrete evidence of my service to the academic community that matters. Some of them are here. They are now fellow colleagues, academics, doing wonderful and wild things. I value you, I honor you, and I thank you. To family who passed, my late sister, my late brother, my late father, you formed me as a person and an academic, but also my mother online and my sister and her family. My life partner and friend and best friend and husband, Dani Brandt, and my daughter, Hannah. I know you wanted to be here. You are here in my heart. So, as jurisprudent, I aim to explore and delve deeper into the idea of the middle as a critical space. The middle is also a space of negotiation. For Derrida, responsible political action lies exactly in the negotiation between two sides. The negotiation, the threshold between two different positions or perspectives is where experience and experimentation takes place. It is this in-between space or border between two opposing poles that I aspire to take up as jurisprudent, or I suppose continue to take up since I've been doing this for more than 3 decades. Taking up office then, and I just remember I had 2 more slides. So this was just Kentridge on jurisography. This is Kentridge's black box that I linked to the Derrida quote. The idea of the pictures was to keep you awake. This is a painting that Julian Rose relies on. The idea is really this middle space between the city, the sort of power of the city, the violence of the city, and then the political actions of the 2 women. But all right, that's my final one. So taking up office then as taking up of a middle space from, and I quote Rose, "We may resume reflexively what we always do, to know, to misknow, and yet to grow. The middle will then show, rendered, not mended. It continues to pulsate, ancient and broken heart of modernity, old and new, west and east." Thank you.
Thank you, Professor van Marle. Congratulations on your journey and your scholarship. We are happy to have you as part of our community, and especially after listening to you, I know that our students are also fortunate to have you here. Let's give her another round of applause. I now call upon Professor Leroux. He is a colleague of ours in the department to respond to the lecture.
Good evening, everybody. I was asked to respond to Karin, and I was told to keep it brief, to do so in 5 minutes. So let me say from the outset, without wasting time, Karin, thank you so much, and congratulations on this beautifully crafted and presented inaugural lecture. I really enjoyed sitting listening here because it was a typical Karin van Marle lecture. Everything that the world has come to love about your work over the past 30 years, for those of you who do not know Karin's work that well, was on show this evening. That's not the right word, but was here in a lecture. So I thought in my response, I just want to highlight 4 things that I find recurring in your work, especially in this lecture, also for the benefit of people who's not perhaps so familiar with Karin's work. The first thing, Karin, you reminded us that you don't start with a principle of law. You typically find law lectures starting with a case or some principle and then working out the logical consequences or implications of this new judgment. You start with something different, and that is positionality, and the position that you hold in the society or don't hold as a white middle-class woman in a settler colonial country. And that makes all the difference, whether we start with the principle of law or our positionality. That's the first thing. I think it runs through the rest of your work as well. That positionality in our context is one of a sense of displacement. It's a sense of an ease and a sense of marginalization, which immediately brings the question of community into play and immediately places community at the center of Karin's work. It becomes the relationship between the law and community, a sense of a just or a true community, and that is the fundamental question. It is not the internal perspective of the jurist that's trying to logically work out the founding principles or rules or values of the legal system. It is this relation between law and society or more particularly community, that you put on the table and that you need to think through. You urge us to think through. The third thing then is that brings us to a sense of genre or a sense of style, this mode of thinking that you keep on talking. How do you think through this relation of law and community? If you step out of the starting of the principle, you need a non-argumentative style of working and writing and presenting a lecture, which is what we saw this evening. One of the genres that you've developed and that people love and respect you for, I don't know what to call it, but in contrast with argumentative, let's call it invocative. Not evocative, but invocative. You've seen tonight Karin invoking bits and pieces from various scholars, from artists, from people in the humanities, because the relationship between law and the humanities, that's what matters. And so it is bringing all these things, conjuring them up, so to speak, for us to explore the relations between them, letting them hang in a certain sense, without closing down or proving an argument or driving point home, because the positionality, the relationship between law and community, Karin insists, this owns us in a certain sense to drive home these solid arguments. You need a different way of thinking and engaging with law and the community. So Karin has developed the style that we saw this evening with the slides evoking a song or an image or a phrase or a concept from a variety of people that she brings together for a brief moment of the duration of the paper, the reading of the paper or the presentation as a community, and they all dissipate at the end of it. There's no solid binding them together around a conclusion. That is the style that Karin has developed and that she's continuing to explore. And if you read her work, that's what inspires people and draws a group of people around the world to Karin's writing and thinking. So then the last point, to remind ourselves that this positionality, this relation, laws and humanity, this new genre or this different genre, this invoking of things, requires a certain withdrawal from the technocratic, from the instrumental, from the administrative, from the controlling, the pedaic elements that she evoked of Robert Cover, and so a certain resistance to the new liberal world that we find ourselves in, the new liberal university, and the pressures on the university from that instrumental direction. So Karin, thank you. You've reminded us of these themes. You've done it continuously for 30 years. You've asked yourself long ago, what does it mean to take office? And you've answered it as a jurisprudent, not as a jurist, and to profess a minor jurisprudence. And your work is embedded in that. I want to finish off by invoking Karin, as she invoked the other people, and say, if Karin van Marle, as she suggests, transformation requires that we live, transformation requires not only that we live under different laws, or more certain laws, but we live differently with the law. What does it mean for the students in the room and fellow lecturers in the room if we take up office to study law or to teach law at this moment and at this place? Thank you, Karin, for provoking us with that question.
Thank you, Professor Leroux, for your response. I now ask Professor Mwambene, the Deputy Dean of Teaching and Learning, to give the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone, and all protocols observed. First of all, I would like to thank all of you gathered here and those connected online for making this inaugural lecture a success. In no particular order, I would like to pay tribute and thank some people who, in their special way, have made tonight possible. First, of course, I would like to thank Professor Karin for delivering such a powerful lecture today. As a faculty, we can proudly say our faculty's name will also be amongst the 2024 UWC calendar of inaugural lectures. Secondly, thank you to the Vice Chancellor, the acting DVC, academic, the registrar, the deans present here, the deputy deans, the HODs from across different faculties present here today. We understand that at this time of the year, your diaries are overflowing with more important matters to attend to. Your presence here and your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you, Professor Leroux, the respondent, Dr. Fick, for being the MC for your special roles today. Behind the scenes of organizing and planning this event and having such a beautifully decorated place is Ms. Davids from the Dean's Office and her team. Please join me in giving a very big round of applause, thanking Ms. Davids and her team for not only organizing this event, but also that it has been executed with much passion. Last but most importantly, thank you to all the colleagues from the university community and from the Faculty of Law, from other universities, the students and visitors who are here today. Your coming has contributed to the success of today's event. And to conclude, of course, Professor Fameva already gave her thanks, but I'll have to quote, because I was once told by my late uncle that you cannot say thank you enough for something which is which you appreciate and which is wonderful. So on behalf of Professor Famareve, and in her own words, and I quote, thank you to the university executive, thank you to the faculty executive, and thank you to everyone who assisted with all the administrative and practical arrangements, students, former students, colleagues, friends, and family. With that, I thank you all.
Thank you. Ms. Adelaide Simons will now present Professor van Marle with a small token of appreciation. I would also like to thank everyone that came out here tonight. This is now the end of the formal program. We will have refreshments upstairs in the foyer. Because we have an academic procession, I'm going to ask you again to all stand up, and the procession will exit, and then we will follow them so that we can also get some refreshments. Thank you once again. You can rise.